Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're not diving into the twisted family trees of inbred royals or the emotional breakdowns of kings who couldn't handle their own inheritance drama. No, tonight we're going down the social ladder. Way down. All the way to the bottom, actually. We're talking about medieval peasants, the people who made up like 90% of the population, but get about 5% of the historical attention. And honestly, after you hear what their daily lives were like, you'll understand why most history books just skip over them. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's take a nice, slow journey into the life of someone who worked harder in a single day than most of us do in a month, and whose reward for all that effort was more work, and maybe some bread, if they were lucky. Let's start with the obvious question. What even is a peasant? Because the word gets thrown around a lot, usually to describe anyone who wasn't rich or noble, but it's actually a bit more specific than that. A medieval peasant was basically a farmer. That's it. That's the job description. You farmed. You worked the land. And the land, by the way, wasn't yours. It belonged to some lord who probably never even visited the village you lived in, but who absolutely expected you to give him a chunk of everything you grew, because of course he did. Now, there were different types of peasants, because medieval Europe loved nothing more than creating incredibly complicated social hierarchies where everyone knew exactly how miserable they were compared to everyone else. At the bottom, you had serfs. Serfs were basically tied to the land. They couldn't leave. They couldn't move to another village or try their luck in a different profession. They were born on that land. They worked that land, and they would die on that land. It wasn't slavery exactly, because they weren't owned by a person. They were owned by the land itself, which is somehow even more depressing. Above serfs, you had free peasants. And yes, free is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Free peasants could technically leave if they wanted. They could own small bits of property. They had slightly more rights, but they still had to work the lord's land several days a week, and they still had to pay taxes, and they still lived in the same tiny mud houses and ate the same boring food as the serfs. So really, the main difference was that free peasants got to feel slightly superior while doing the exact same back-breaking labor. Let's talk about where these people lived, because it's not great. The typical peasant home was what we generously call a cottage, but what was actually just a one-room hut made of wood, mud, and hope. The walls were wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying sticks woven together and covered in a mixture of mud, dung, and straw. Yes, dung, animal poop, mixed right into the walls. Because why not? It was readily available, it was free, and it actually worked pretty well as insulation. Did it smell? Probably. Did anyone care? Not really. Everyone smelled bad anyway.
The roof was usually thatch, which is dried straw or reeds bundled together. Thatch was great because it was cheap and easy to replace. It was also great if you were a family of mice, because thatch roofs were basically luxury apartments for rodents and insects and birds. Sometimes, if the thatch got old enough, entire ecosystems would develop up there. You'd have mice, spiders, beetles, the occasional bird's nest, all living together in harmony about 3 feet above your head while you tried to sleep. Inside the cottage, you had one room. That's it. One room. And in that room, you had everything. You slept there, you cooked there, you ate there, You gave birth there. You died there. If you had animals, and most peasants had at least a few chickens or a pig, those animals also lived in the room with you. Sometimes there'd be a little partition to separate the animal area from the people area, but often there wasn't. You just shared the space with the chickens and the pig, who, by the way, did not care about your personal boundaries. Furniture was minimal. You might have a table, maybe a stool or two, a chest for storing things if you were doing well. Beds were a luxury most peasants couldn't afford, so people usually slept on the floor on piles of straw. The straw was your mattress, your pillow, and your blanket, all in one. You'd cover yourself with whatever fabric you had, which wasn't much, and you'd sleep next to your entire family because body heat was important and privacy was a concept for rich people. The floor, by the way, was dirt, just packed earth. Sometimes people would scatter rushes or straw on the ground to make it slightly less bleak, but mostly you just walked on dirt all day. When it rained, the floor would get muddy. When it was dry, it would be dusty. There was no winning. Let's talk about light, because that's another thing we take completely for granted. When the sun went down, peasants had basically two options. Option 1, go to sleep. This was the popular choice, because it was free and you were exhausted anyway. Option 2, light a candle or a rushlight. Candles were expensive, so most peasants used rushlights, which were basically the world's saddest light source. You'd take a rush, a type of plant, and soak it in animal fat. Then you'd light it. It would burn for maybe an hour if you were lucky, and it would give off a dim, flickering light that barely illuminated anything. Also, it smelled like burning fat, because that's literally what it was. Some homes had a central hearth for cooking and heating. The fire would burn in the middle of the room, and the smoke would theoretically rise up and escape through a hole in the roof. Theoretically. In practice, a lot of the smoke would just hang around inside the house, making everything smell like wood smoke all the time. Your clothes smelled like smoke, your hair smelled like smoke, you smelled like smoke. But again, everyone smelled like something, so smoke was actually one of the better options.
Now let's get to the fun part. Food. What did medieval peasants eat? The answer is not much and not well. The basic peasant diet was bread. Just bread. Lots and lots of bread. Bread for breakfast, bread for lunch, bread for dinner. But not the nice fluffy bread you're thinking of. This was dark, heavy, coarse bread made from rye or barley. Wheat was for rich people. Peasants got the cheap grains. If you were having a good day, you might have some pottage with your bread. Pottage was basically a thick stew made from whatever you had lying around. Vegetables, grains, maybe a little bit of meat if you were incredibly lucky. You'd make a big pot of it and eat from it for days. You just keep adding things to the pot as the week went on. Some water, some onions, some cabbage, maybe a turnip if you were feeling fancy. It was never delicious, but it was food, and it was hot, and that was usually enough. Meat was rare, very rare. Most peasants ate meat maybe a few times a year, usually during festivals or after an animal died. You couldn't just go out and hunt, by the way. The forests belonged to the Lord, and so did all the animals in them. If you were caught poaching a deer, you could lose a hand. So yeah, hunting was not an option. You might have a pig or some chickens, but those were valuable. You didn't eat your pig just because you felt like bacon. You kept that pig alive as long as possible because it was an investment. Dairy was more common, if you had a cow or some goats. Cheese, butter, milk, these were all things peasants might actually have access to. But again, you couldn't just drink all the milk. You needed to turn it into cheese so it would last.
Fresh milk would spoil in a day. Cheese could last for months. So you made cheese and you ate cheese, and you got very tired of cheese. Vegetables were stable. Onions, cabbage, turnips, leeks, peas, beans. If it grew easily and didn't require much care, peasants ate it. Fruit was less common, but apples and pears grew in many places. You'd eat them fresh in the fall and dried in the winter. Berries were a nice treat if you could find them. But again, you had to be careful about foraging on the Lord's land, because technically those berries belonged to him too. Everything belonged to him. The trees, the streams, the air you breathed. Okay, maybe not the air, but you get the idea. Drinks were another interesting situation. You might think peasants drank water, and they did, but not as much as you'd expect. Water sources were often contaminated. Rivers and streams were used for washing, for dumping waste, for everything. Drinking that water was a risky move. So instead, peasants drank ale. Weak ale, but ale nonetheless. Everyone drank ale, men, women, children. It was safer than water because the brewing process killed some of the bacteria. So yes, medieval children were mildly buzzed most of the time, which honestly might explain a lot.
Let's talk about a day in the life, because that's where things get really exhausting. A peasant's day started at dawn, not because they wanted to be up at dawn, but because there was no point wasting daylight when you had 14 hours of work ahead of you. You'd wake up on your pile of straw, probably sore from sleeping on the ground, definitely cold because your house had terrible insulation and your blanket was about as thick as a modern kitchen towel. Breakfast, if you ate it at all, was bread, maybe some ale, maybe a bit of cheese if you were doing well. Then it was straight to work, and the work depended on the season, because medieval agriculture was entirely dictated by the time of year. In spring, you were plowing. Plowing was brutal. If you had an ox, you'd hitch it to a wooden plow and try to turn the soil. If you didn't have an ox, you'd pull the plow yourself, or you and several other peasants would pull it together because plows were heavy and soil was hard. You'd walk back and forth across the field, over and over, trying to break up the earth so you could plant seeds. Your back would ache, your hands would blister, your legs would tremble, and you'd do this for days. After plowing came planting. You'd walk through the fields scattering seeds by hand, wheat, barley, rye, oats, whatever you were growing that year. You'd scatter the seeds and hope they'd take root. Then you'd pray, a lot, because your survival depended entirely on those seeds growing into crops, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to control the weather or the pests or the diseases that could wipe out an entire harvest. Summer was slightly less backbreaking, but only slightly. You'd weed the fields, you'd tend to your small vegetable garden, you'd shear sheep if you had them. You'd make hay, which involved cutting grass with a scythe, letting it dry, and then stacking it for winter animal feed. It was hot, sweaty work, and you'd be covered in bits of grass and dust, and probably some insect bites. Then came harvest season, late summer into fall. This was the most important time of the year, and also the most exhausting. Everything had to be harvested quickly before the weather turned or animals got into the fields or the crops rotted. You'd use a sickle to cut the grain, bundling it into sheaths. Then you'd thresh it, which meant beating the grain to separate the edible parts from the chaff. Then you'd winnow it, tossing it in the air, so the wind would blow away the lighter chaff and leave the heavier grain. It was repetitive, exhausting, and absolutely critical. If you didn't get the harvest in, you didn't eat that winter. It was that simple.
And remember, you weren't just harvesting your own crops. You also had to harvest the Lord's crops. Several days a week, you had to work his fields instead of your own. This was called labor service, and it was mandatory. You didn't get paid, you didn't get extra food, you just had to do it. Because that was the deal. He let you live on his land, and you gave him your labor and a portion of your harvest. Fair? Absolutely not. But fairness wasn't really a medieval concept. Winter was the slow season, but that's relative. You still had animals to care for. You still had firewood to chop. You still had repairs to make, and clothes to mend, and food to prepare. Plus, you were cold all the time. Your house was freezing, your clothes were thin. You probably didn't have enough firewood to keep a fire going all day and all night, so you rationed it. You'd huddle together with your family for warmth. You'd go to bed early because there was nothing else to do, and at least sleeping meant you weren't actively freezing. Hygiene. Let's talk about hygiene because it's not what you think. There's this myth that medieval people never bathed and were all just walking around covered in filth. That's not entirely true. Peasants did bathe, just not often. Maybe once a week if they were dedicated, less frequently if it was winter. They'd heat water over the fire and wash themselves with a cloth. Soap existed, but it was a luxury, so most people just used water. It wasn't a long, relaxing bath. It was a quick, functional wash to get the worst of the dirt off. Clothes were washed even less frequently because washing clothes was a huge ordeal. You had to haul water, heat it, scrub the clothes by hand, and then hang them to dry. And you only had 1 or 2 outfits, so you couldn't wash your clothes whenever you wanted. You'd wear them for weeks or months, and they'd get dirty and smelly and stained, and you'd just keep wearing them. Teeth were another disaster. Toothbrushes didn't exist, toothpaste didn't exist. People would sometimes chew on twigs to clean their teeth or rinse their mouths with water, but that was about it. By the time you were 30, you'd probably lost several teeth. By the time you were 40, you might not have many left. Dental pain was just part of life, and there was no real treatment except pulling the tooth out, which was about as pleasant as it sounds. Bathrooms, or rather, the lack thereof. Peasants didn't have toilets. They had a hole in the ground outside, or a bucket inside that had to be emptied. You'd do your business, and then, well, you wouldn't wash your hands with soap because you didn't have soap. You might rinse them with water if you thought about it. Mostly, you'd just wipe them on your clothes and move on with your day.
This is probably a good place to mention that disease was everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. You could get sick from the water, from the food, from other people, from the animals living in your house. Dysentery was common. Typhoid was common. Tuberculosis was common. Parasites were extremely common. Most people had worms, just intestinal worms living inside them, because hygiene was minimal and food safety wasn't a thing. If you got sick, your options were limited. There were no doctors for peasants. Doctors were for wealthy people. You might have a local healer, usually a woman who knew which herbs did what. She might give you something to help with the pain or the fever. It might work. It might not. Mostly you just suffer through it and hope you didn't die. A lot of people died. Child mortality was staggering. Roughly half of all children died before the age of 5. Half. If you had 6 kids, you could reasonably expect 3 of them to die young. They'd die from disease, from malnutrition, from accidents, from infections that would be easily treatable today but were death sentences then. And you'd mourn them, of course, but you'd also move on.
because you had to. You had other children to care for and work to do and no time to fall apart completely. If you made it past childhood, you still weren't in the clear. Life expectancy for a medieval peasant was somewhere in the 30s. 30s. Some people lived longer, sure, but many didn't. They'd work themselves to exhaustion, or they'd get sick, or they'd have an accident. Farming was dangerous. You could get kicked by a horse, gored by an ox, fall off a roof while repairing thatch, cut yourself with a scythe and get an infection. Any injury could turn deadly if it got infected, and most injuries got infected because, again, hygiene. Let me paint a picture of what you'd actually look like as a medieval peasant, because it's not pretty. You'd be shorter than modern people, because malnutrition during childhood stunts growth. You'd be thin, but not in a healthy way, more in a my body is eating its own muscle because I don't get enough protein way. Your skin would be weathered and rough from working outside in all weather. Your hands would be calloused and scarred. Your fingernails would be broken and dirty. Your hair would be unwashed and probably full of lice. Your teeth, as mentioned, would be a disaster. You'd have scars, lots of scars, from work accidents, from childhood mishaps, from infections that eventually healed. You'd probably have at least one crooked bone from a break that healed badly because no one set it properly. You'd ache constantly. Your back, your knees, your hands, everything would hurt all the time because you'd been doing hard physical labor since you were old enough to walk. Your clothes would be simple and practical. A rough tunic made of wool or linen, brown or gray because dyes were expensive. Maybe a belt to hold it closed, leggings or hose if you were a man, a long skirt if you were a woman, a cloak for cold weather. Shoes were a luxury, so many peasants went barefoot, especially in summer. In winter, you might have some rough leather shoes or wooden clogs. They wouldn't fit well, and they definitely wouldn't be comfortable, but they'd keep your feet from freezing. Women had the added joy of doing all of the above while also being responsible for most of the household tasks. Cooking, cleaning, caring for children, making clothes, brewing ale, tending the garden, preserving food, caring for small animals. It was endless. Men worked the fields and did the heavy agricultural labor, but women worked just as hard, if not harder, because their work never stopped. Even in winter, even at night, there were always things to do. And if you were a woman, you'd also be pregnant a lot. Contraception didn't really exist, so if you were married, you were probably having babies every couple of years. And childbirth, of course, was incredibly dangerous. Many women died in childbirth or shortly after, from infections or hemorrhaging. It was one of the leading causes of death for women of bearing age. If you survived multiple births, you were lucky. Let's drift over to the social side of things, because life wasn't all misery and work. Okay, it was mostly misery and work, but there were brief moments of non-misery. The church was a huge part of peasant life. Sundays were technically rest days, so you'd go to church. The service would be in Latin, which you didn't understand, but you'd go anyway because it was required. You'd stand there, no pews for peasants, and listen to the priest talk about sin and salvation and the importance of accepting your lot in life because God had ordained it. The church taught that the social order was divinely mandated. God wanted kings to be kings and lords to be lords and peasants to be peasants. If you were born a peasant, it was because that was God's plan for you, and trying to change that was going against God's will. Convenient for the people at the top, less convenient for everyone else. But most peasants accepted this because what choice did they have? Rebellion was rare and usually ended badly. There were festivals, though, religious holidays that broke up the monotony. Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days. On these days you might get a break from work. You might have slightly better food. There might be music or dancing or games.
These were genuinely happy times, brief escapes from the grind. People would gather in the village, drink ale, celebrate together. It was community and joy, and a reminder that life wasn't entirely awful.
Alehouses existed in some villages, and they were important social spaces. Men would gather to drink and talk, and complain about their lords and the weather and the price of grain. It was a chance to socialize, to connect with people outside your immediate family. Women had fewer opportunities for this kind of socializing, but they'd gather at the well or while working in the fields, sharing gossip and advice. Marriage was practical. You didn't marry for love, though sometimes love happened anyway. You married because you needed a partner to help with the work. Two people could run a household better than one. Marriages were usually arranged by families, and they happened young. Girls might be married by 14 or 15, boys a bit older. You'd have a simple ceremony, maybe a small celebration, and then you'd move into your one-room hut and start your life of shared labor and survival. All right, we're going to pause here. We've covered the basics, the housing, the food, the work, the hygiene, the brutal reality of just existing as a medieval peasant. And we haven't even gotten into the really specific stuff yet. The taxes, the laws, the feudal obligations, the weird superstitions, the terrifying medical treatments. But don't worry, we'll get there. Let your mind rest for a moment in this nice, calm space where you're very grateful you have running water and antibiotics and a bed that's not just a pile of straw on a dirt floor. We'll continue in just a bit.
Welcome back. Hope you're still comfy, still relaxed, because we're diving deeper into the peasant experience now. And by deeper, I mean we're going to explore all the creative ways medieval society found to make peasant life even harder than it already was. Because apparently, working yourself to exhaustion every day wasn't enough. You also needed to give away a huge chunk of what you produced, follow a million arbitrary rules, and live in constant fear of both earthly and supernatural consequences. Let's talk about taxes. Oh, the taxes. Because if you thought modern tax season was annoying, just wait until you hear about medieval peasant obligations. First, there was the basic arrangement with your lord. You lived on his land, so you owed him. You owed him labor, usually 2 or 3 days a week working his fields instead of your own. You owed him a portion of your harvest, not a small portion either. Often it was a third of everything you grew, sometimes more. Then there was the tithe. This was the 10% you owed to the church. 10% of your crops, your animals, everything. The church needed funding, obviously, and peasants were the ones who provided it. The tithe was supposed to support your local priest and maintain the church building and help the poor. In practice, a lot of it went up the chain to bishops and abbots who were living much more comfortably than anyone in your village. But wait, there's more, because of course there is. There were additional fees for basically everything. You wanted to grind your grain into flour? You had to use the Lord's mill, and you had to pay for the privilege. You couldn't just grind your grain at home with your own tools. That was forbidden. The Lord had a monopoly on milling, and he charged for it. Same thing with baking. Many lords had communal ovens, and you had to pay to use them. You couldn't build your own oven, or if you did, you had to pay a fee for that too. Wanted to brew ale? There might be a fee. Getting married? Fee. Having a baby? Believe it or not, sometimes there was a fee for that too, especially if you were a serf. It was called merchant, and it was basically a payment to the lord for permission to marry off your daughter.
because your daughter was, technically, part of the Lord's property, being tied to his land, and he needed to be compensated for losing her labor. If you inherited anything, even just your father's old tools and his tiny plot of land, you might owe a heriot, which was basically an inheritance tax. Usually it was your best animal. So your father dies, and as you're grieving, you also have to hand over your best ox to the Lord. Great timing. Very compassionate system. There were also labor obligations beyond the regular field work. The Lord needed his manor maintained, his roads repaired, his fences mended. Guess who did all that work? That's right, peasants, for free. It was called boon work, which is a hilariously positive name for forced unpaid labor. Hey, could you do me a boon and build my new barn? Thanks so much. And let's not forget that on top of all this, there was the king's tax. The Lord paid taxes to the king, and guess where the Lord got that money? He squeezed it out of the peasants, obviously. Royal taxes varied depending on what the king needed at the moment. Fighting a war? Tax. Building a castle? Tax. Daughter getting married? Tax to pay for the wedding feast. The reasons were endless, and the peasants paid for all of it. So let's do some quick math here. You're giving up about 1/3 of your harvest to your Lord, 10% to the church, various fees and taxes that add up to maybe another 10 or 20%. You're left with less than half of what you actually grew. And out of that remaining portion, you need to feed your family for an entire year, save seed for next year's planting, and maybe trade some for other necessities like cloth or tools. It was incredibly tight. One bad harvest could mean starvation. And bad harvests happened a lot. You could have a late frost that killed your crops. Too much rain could rot them in the fields. Too little rain could dry them out. Locusts could swarm through and devour everything. Blight could spread through the grain. There were so many ways for things to go wrong, and when they did, it was catastrophic. During a famine, peasants would eat things that weren't really food: tree bark, grass, acorns, even though they're mildly toxic and make you sick. Anything to fill the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. People would abandon their homes and wander, looking for food, begging. Some would die by the roadside. Villages would empty out. It was bleak, incredibly bleak. But let's move away from starvation for a moment and talk about the legal system, because peasants had basically no legal rights, which made everything even more fun. If you had a dispute with another peasant, you'd bring it to the manor court, which was presided over by the lord or his representative. The lord was judge, jury, and executioner, though usually not literally an executioner, because that would mean losing a laborer. The punishments for crimes were creative. For minor offenses, you might be put in the stocks or the pillory. These were wooden devices that locked around your hands and head, and you'd be left in the village square for everyone to see. People would throw things at you: rotten vegetables if you were lucky, worse things if you weren't. It was public humiliation, designed to shame you into behaving. For more serious crimes, the punishments got harsher. Theft could cost you a hand, though again, lords were often reluctant to maim peasants because maimed peasants couldn't work as well. So you might get a severe beating instead, or a branding. Some places used outlawry, where you'd be declared outside the protection of the law. Anyone could harm you, and you had no recourse. Basically, you had to flee and never come back. Accusations of witchcraft or heresy were particularly dangerous, though these became more common in the later medieval period. If someone accused you of cursing their crops or consorting with demons, you could be in serious trouble. Trials were not what we'd call fair.
Sometimes they'd use trial by ordeal. You'd be forced to hold a hot iron or plunge your hand into boiling water. And if the wound healed cleanly, you were innocent. If it got infected, you were guilty. Considering that most wounds got infected, this was not a great system for the accused. There was also trial by combat, but that was mostly for nobles. Peasants didn't get to duel over their honor. They just got punished. Let's talk about superstitions, because medieval peasant life was absolutely soaked in them. Christianity was the official religion, sure, but it existed alongside a whole bunch of folk beliefs and practices that were technically pagan, but that everyone did anyway. People believed in fairies, elves, spirits of the forest and the water. They believed that certain days were unlucky for planting or marrying. They believed in charms and curses. If your cow stopped giving milk, it wasn't just bad luck. Someone had cursed it. Maybe a neighbor you'd argued with, or the old woman at the edge of the village who everyone suspected of being a witch. You'd need a counter-charm. Maybe you'd hang an iron horseshoe over your door to ward off evil. Or you'd get a blessing from the priest. Or you'd consult the local cunning woman who knew spells and herbs.
Illness was often blamed on supernatural causes. You weren't sick because of bacteria or viruses. Those concepts didn't exist yet. You were sick because you'd been cursed, or because you'd angered a saint, or because you'd walked through a fairy ring and the fairies had taken offense. Treatment involved a mix of herbal remedies and spiritual interventions, prayers, pilgrimages to holy sites, amulets worn around the neck. Relics were considered incredibly powerful. A splinter of the true cross, a bone from a saint, a scrap of cloth that had touched a holy person. These things could supposedly cure illness, protect you from harm, bring good fortune. Churches collected relics, and people would travel to see them, praying for miracles. Did the miracles happen? Sometimes people got better, sure. Sometimes they didn't. But faith was a powerful thing, and when you had no other options, you took comfort where you could find it. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly surrounded by superstition and ritual. Pregnant women would wear certain amulets, say certain prayers, avoid certain foods. During labor, you'd have a midwife, an older woman with experience who'd delivered many babies. She'd know some practical things, like how to position the mother, when to cut the cord. But she'd also do things like placing a knife under the bed to cut the pain, or tying a red string around the mother's wrist to ward off evil spirits. Many babies were born, and many babies died. If a baby was sickly, people might believe it was a changeling, a fairy child left in place of the real baby who'd been stolen away. There were folk rituals to try to get the real baby back, none of which actually worked, obviously, because the baby was just sick, not a magical replacement. Herbs played a huge role in peasant medicine. There were no pharmacies, no antibiotics, no real understanding of how disease worked, but people had figured out, through trial and error over centuries, that certain plants helped with certain ailments. Willow bark for pain and fever. It contains salicin, which is related to aspirin, so that actually worked a bit. Chamomile for upset stomachs and anxiety. Yarrow to stop bleeding. Garlic for infections. It does have some antimicrobial properties, though not nearly enough to cure serious infections. But alongside genuinely helpful herbs, there was also a lot of nonsense. People believed in the doctrine of signatures, which held that plants resembled the body parts they could cure. A walnut, which looks like a brain, would be good for headaches. Lungwort, which has spotted leaves that kind of look like lungs, would help with respiratory problems. There was no actual basis for this, but it was widely believed.
Bloodletting was a common treatment for all sorts of ailments. The idea was that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much blood? Let some out. You'd go to a barber surgeon. The same person who cut your hair would also open your veins, and they'd make a small cut and drain some blood into a bowl. Did this help? Almost never. Did it sometimes make things worse? Absolutely. But it was standard medical practice, and people genuinely believed it worked. Leeches were also used for bloodletting. You'd apply leeches to the skin and let them drink their fill. This was thought to remove bad blood and restore balance. In reality, it just made you weaker and more anemic, which is not ideal when you're already sick. For broken bones, the treatment was basic but sometimes effective. You'd set the bone as best you could, splint it with wood, and hope it healed straight. Often it didn't. People walked around with crooked arms and legs, limps from badly healed fractures, but at least the bone had mended, even imperfectly. Dental care, as mentioned, was basically non-existent. If you had a rotten tooth causing you agony, the solution was extraction. The barber surgeon would pull it out with pliers. No anesthesia, no numbing. Just hold the person down and yank. People dreaded it, but they dreaded the constant pain more, so eventually they'd submit to the extraction. Let's float over to what children actually did all day. Because childhood as a carefree time of play and learning, not really a thing for peasant kids. Children started working young. By age 5 or 6, you'd have chores: feeding chickens, gathering eggs, pulling weeds, watching younger siblings. By 7 or 8, you'd be doing more substantial work. Boys would help in the fields, learning to plow and sow and reap. Girls would help with household tasks, learning to cook and spin and brew ale. There was no formal education for peasant children. Schools were for the wealthy. Most peasants were illiterate and remained that way their entire lives. You didn't need to read to farm. You learned by watching and doing. Your father taught you how to work the land, how to care for animals, how to repair tools. Your mother taught you how to run a household. That was your education.
Play happened, but it was limited. Children would make simple toys, dolls from straw, balls from bundled rags. They'd play games, many of which are recognizable today: tag, hide and seek, simple ball games. They'd swim in streams in summer, slide on ice in winter. But there wasn't a lot of free time for play. There was always work to be done, and children were expected to contribute. Childhood was also dangerous. Children died from disease, from accidents, from simple bad luck. They'd drown in rivers, fall from trees, get kicked by animals. And because parents expected to lose children, the emotional landscape was complicated. Parents loved their children, of course, but they also maintained a certain emotional distance, because getting too attached to a baby who might not see their first birthday was a recipe for constant heartbreak. If you survived to adulthood, your life path was pretty much set. You'd do what your parents did: farm the same land, live in the same village, marry someone from a neighboring village, or maybe even your own. Social mobility didn't exist. You were born a peasant, you'd die a peasant. Your children would be peasants. Your grandchildren would be peasants. On, generation after generation. There were exceptions, of course. A few rare individuals managed to escape. The church was one avenue. If a boy showed promise, he might be sent to a monastery. Monks came from all social classes, and once you were in the church, your origins mattered less. You could rise through the ranks based on ability and connections. But this was rare. Most peasant families couldn't afford to lose the labor of a child.
Some young men became apprentices to craftsmen in towns, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a baker. You'd leave your village, move to a town, and learn a trade. It was still hard work, and apprenticeships could be brutal. You were basically unpaid labor for years, but it was a different life than farming. Again, this was unusual. Most peasants stayed put. Women had even fewer options. Marriage and motherhood were pretty much the only path. A woman who didn't marry was pitied and often impoverished. She might live with relatives, doing household work in exchange for room and board. She might become a servant. The only other option was entering a convent, but that required a dowry, which most peasant families couldn't provide.
Let's talk about village life and community, because it wasn't all isolation and misery. Villages were tight-knit communities. Everyone knew everyone. You'd known your neighbors your entire life, and so had your parents and grandparents. There was a sense of communal identity. These were your people. You'd help each other during harvest time, share resources during hard times, celebrate together during festivals. But that closeness also meant no privacy and no escape from gossip. Everyone knew your business. If you fought with your spouse, the whole village would know by the end of the day. If you were lazy or dishonest, your reputation would suffer. Social pressure was intense. You had to maintain good standing in the community because you depended on these people for survival. The village had a social hierarchy even among peasants. The wealthier peasants, those with more land, more animals, had more status. They might serve as village officials, representing the community to the lord. At the bottom were the landless laborers, people who owned nothing and worked for others in exchange for food and a place to sleep. But even the wealthiest peasant was still a peasant, still subject to the lord, still doing backbreaking labor. There was often a village green or common area where animals could graze. This was shared land, and everyone had a right to use it. It was one of the few truly communal resources. Disputes over the commons did happen, though. Someone letting their animals take more than their fair share, or someone using it in a way others objected to. These disputes would be settled at the manor court. Alehouses, as mentioned, were social hubs, but there were also informal gathering places. The well where people drew water, the church after services, the fields during harvest where people worked side by side and talked while they worked. These were the spaces where community happened, where news was shared, where bonds were formed. Traveling entertainers occasionally passed through villages, jugglers, musicians, storytellers. Their arrival was a big event. Everyone would gather to watch and listen. It was a break from routine, a taste of the wider world. The stories were often about knights and lords and faraway places, things that had nothing to do with peasant life, but that were fascinating precisely because they were so different. Religious pilgrimages were another way to see beyond the village. If you were particularly devout, or if you'd made a vow, you might go on pilgrimage to a holy site. Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome if you were very ambitious. These journeys were difficult and dangerous. You'd walk for weeks or months, sleeping rough, relying on the charity of monasteries and fellow pilgrims. But it was an adventure, a chance to see new places and meet new people. For a peasant whose entire life was confined to a few square miles, this was huge. Most peasants never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. The next village over was a journey. The nearest town might be a place you visited once a year, maybe, for a market day. The world was small and local, and that was just how it was.
Let's drift into the seasonal rhythms a bit more, because understanding the agricultural calendar is key to understanding peasant life. Everything revolved around the seasons, and the work was relentless but varied. Winter, as mentioned, was the slow season, but you still had plenty to do. Animals needed daily care, cows needed milking, chickens needed feeding, pigs needed tending. You'd mend tools, repair clothes, make rope, weave baskets. Women would spin wool or flax into thread, then weave the thread into cloth. This was done by hand, on a simple loom, and it took forever. Making enough cloth for a single tunic could take weeks of work. Men might do woodworking, carving bowls or spoons or handles for tools. Firewood needed to be chopped constantly, thatch roofs needed patching, fences needed repairs. It wasn't exciting work, but it was necessary. Spring was frantic, plowing, planting, praying for good weather. You'd also be dealing with spring births among the animals, lambs, calves, piglets, chicks. These baby animals needed extra care, and losing them was a real blow. You'd also plant your vegetable garden, onions, peas, beans, leeks, whatever would grow in your region.
Late spring and early summer were somewhat calmer, but you'd be weeding, monitoring the crops, making sure animals didn't get into the fields. Sheep shearing happened in early summer. You'd wrestle the sheep, shear off their wool with hand shears, and then spend days washing and preparing the wool for spinning. It was itchy, sweaty work. Haymaking happened in midsummer. You'd cut the grass with scythes, let it dry in the sun, then gather it into haystacks for winter animal feed. This had to be done on dry days, and you had to work fast before the weather changed. Everyone helped. Men, women, children. It was all hands on deck. Then came the harvest in late summer and early fall. This was the most critical time of year. Everything depended on getting the harvest in successfully. You'd work from dawn to dusk, sometimes longer if the weather threatened. Cutting, binding, stacking, threshing. Every able-bodied person worked. It was exhausting, but there was also a sense of shared purpose, and, if the harvest was good, relief and even joy. After the harvest, there were harvest festivals. Finally, a reason to celebrate. There'd be feasting. Well, feasting by peasant standards, so better food than usual, maybe some meat. There'd be ale, music, dancing. It was a release of tension, a collective sigh of relief that you'd made it through another year. Autumn was for preserving food and preparing for winter. You'd slaughter animals that you couldn't afford to feed through the winter, preserving the meat by salting or smoking it. You'd make cheese, pickle vegetables, store grain. Every bit of food had to be carefully managed, because once winter came, there'd be no more fresh food until spring. November was when you'd pay your dues to the Lord, handing over your portion of the harvest. This was a tense time, because you'd see exactly how much you were left with. Some years it was enough. Some years it was frighteningly little.
And then winter would close in again, and the cycle would continue. Year after year after year. The same work, the same struggles, the same hope that next year might be slightly better. It usually wasn't. Let's talk about what you'd actually wear in a bit more detail, because clothing was a bigger deal than you might think. As mentioned, most peasants had one or two outfits. Making clothes was a massive undertaking. First, you had to produce the fabric, raise the sheep, shear them, wash and card the wool, spin it into thread,
then weave the thread into cloth. Or grow flax, harvest it, ret it, which meant soaking it until the fibers separated, then spin and weave it into linen. This took months. Then you had to cut and sew the cloth into garments. Needles were precious items, carefully guarded. You'd sew by hand every stitch. A tunic might take weeks to complete. So once you had an outfit, you wore it until it literally fell apart. Then you'd patch it and patch the patches and keep wearing it. Clothes were valuable enough to be inherited. Your father's old tunic would be passed down to you, altered if needed. When someone died, their clothes were often listed in wills, distributed to family members. This seems strange to us now, but when you understand how much labor went into creating a single garment, it makes sense. Colors were limited. Natural wool was white, brown, gray, or black, depending on the sheep. Most peasants wore undyed cloth in these natural colors. Dyes were expensive. Blues came from woad, reds from madder, both of which required processing and skill. Rich, vibrant colors were for the wealthy. Peasants wore dull earth tones. Undergarments were minimal. Men might have a linen undershirt beneath their wool tunic. Women might have a linen undershift beneath their dress. This helped protect the outer garment from body oils and sweat, and the linen could be washed more easily than wool. But many peasants couldn't afford these extras. They just wore the one layer.
In winter, you'd layer everything you owned. Your tunic, your cloak, maybe an extra shirt if you had one. You'd wrap cloth around your feet before putting on your shoes, assuming you had shoes, and you'd still be cold. Medieval peasants were cold for months every year. There was no escaping it. All right, let's pause here again. We've covered taxes, laws, superstitions, medicine, childhood, village life, the seasonal grind, clothing. You're getting a pretty full picture now of what it meant to be a medieval peasant. It meant working constantly, owning almost nothing, being subject to arbitrary authority, and hoping you'd survive long enough to see your children grow up. We still have more to explore, though. The relationship between peasants and nobles, the rare moments of resistance and rebellion, what happened when peasants tried to improve their lot, and just more of the grinding, endless details of a life that was hard in ways we can barely imagine from our modern perspective. Rest your mind here for a moment. Appreciate your heating and your closet full of clothes and the fact that no one demands a third of your groceries as tribute to a lord. We'll continue soon.
Still with me? Good. Get comfortable, because we're settling in for the long haul now. We've covered the basics of peasant life, the houses, the food, the work, the taxes. We've talked about superstitions and medicine and the endless cycle of seasons. But there's so much more to unpack. The relationship between peasants and their lords was more complex than just poor people work, rich people take. There were rebellions, there were tiny victories, there were social dynamics that kept the whole system running for centuries. And there were women whose experiences deserve a much closer look, because honestly, being a peasant woman was its own special level of difficult. So let's start with the manor system itself, because understanding how this whole thing was structured helps explain why it was so hard to escape. The manor was the basic unit of medieval rural life. It wasn't just the lord's big house, though that was part of it. The manor was the entire estate, including all the villages, fields, forests, and people on it. The lord owned all of it.
He might live in a manor house or a castle on the property, or he might live somewhere else entirely and just collect income from this land. Either way, he controlled everything. The manor was supposed to be self-sufficient. It produced its own food, made its own cloth, raised its own animals. Peasants did all this work, of course. The lord just owned it and benefited from it. In theory, this was a mutual arrangement. The lord provided protection and justice, and the peasants provided labor and food. In practice, it was incredibly one-sided, but that's feudalism for you. The lord's land was divided into sections. There was the domain, which was the lord's personal farmland. Peasants worked this land directly for the lord's benefit. Everything grown on the domain belonged to him. Then there were the tenant holdings, strips of land that peasants could farm for themselves. But remember, even though you farmed your own strips, you didn't own them. The land belonged to the lord. You just had the right to use it in exchange for all those taxes and fees and labor obligations we talked about. Fields were organized using the open field system in most of medieval Europe. Instead of each peasant having their own separate farm, the village's farmland was divided into huge fields, and each peasant had strips scattered throughout those fields. Your strips might be next to your neighbor's strips, then someone else's, then some of the lord's domain. It was all mixed together. Why this system? A few reasons. First, it was fair in a medieval kind of way. Some land was better than other land, more fertile, better drainage, whatever. By giving everyone strips in different parts of the field, you spread out the good and bad land. Everyone got some of each. Second, it encouraged cooperation. You couldn't plow or harvest your individual strips very efficiently. It made more sense to work together, plowing whole sections at once. So peasant life was inherently communal, whether you liked your neighbors or not.
The downside was that you couldn't really innovate. You couldn't decide to try a new crop or a different planting method on your strips because you had to coordinate with everyone else. The whole village planted the same crops at the same time and harvested them together. Individual initiative wasn't really an option. The system was conservative by design, maintaining the same practices generation after generation. Crop rotation was practiced, though. Most places used a three-field system. One field would be planted with winter wheat or rye in the fall. One field would be planted with spring crops like barley, oats, or legumes. And one field would lie fallow, left unplanted to recover its fertility. Every year you'd rotate which field was which. It wasn't the most efficient system ever devised, but it worked reasonably well and prevented soil exhaustion. The fallow field would be used for grazing animals, which helped fertilize it with their droppings. Manure was precious, by the way. Animal dung was collected carefully and spread on the fields. Human waste, too, sometimes. Anything that might help the crops grow. People understood, at least in a basic way, that animal waste made plants grow better. They didn't understand the chemistry of nitrogen and nutrients, but they knew it worked. Now let's talk about the Lord himself and what he actually did. In the early medieval period, lords were often military men, knights or minor nobles who held the land in exchange for providing military service to a higher lord or the king. This was the feudal contract, land for loyalty and military support. The lord would have to show up with a certain number of armed men when called upon. He might go off to war for months, leaving a steward or bailiff to manage the manor in his absence. The bailiff was usually the person peasants actually dealt with day to day. He was the lord's representative, responsible for making sure the work got done, the rents got paid, the lord's interests were protected. Bailiffs could be minor nobles themselves, or sometimes they were just wealthier peasants who'd been promoted. They had authority, and they used it. A bailiff could make your life easier by being lenient about a late payment, or he could make it miserable by enforcing every single rule to the letter. A lot depended on what kind of person he was.
There was also the reeve, who was elected among the peasants, or sometimes voluntold, to serve as a liaison between the village and the lord's administration. The reeve helped organize labor, kept track of who owed what, and generally tried to keep things running smoothly. It was a thankless position. You were a peasant yourself, but you had to enforce the lord's rules on your neighbors, which didn't make you popular. But you also had a bit more authority and maybe some small privileges, so some people wanted the job.
The relationship between peasants and their lord was supposed to be paternalistic. The lord was the father figure, stern but fair, who provided for his people and protected them. In return, the people owed him obedience and labor. This was the ideology, anyway. The reality was that most lords viewed peasants as resources to be exploited. They weren't cruel for cruelty's sake, mostly, but they definitely prioritized their own wealth and status over the well-being of the peasants. Some lords were decent. They'd reduce rents during bad harvest years, or they'd provide grain from their stores during famines, or they'd settle disputes fairly. These lords were remembered fondly, and peasants would feel genuine loyalty toward them. But plenty of lords were harsh, greedy, and indifferent to suffering. They'd squeeze every possible penny out of their peasants, ignoring pleas for mercy during hard times. And there wasn't much peasants could do about it, because the whole system was designed to keep them in place. Legally, peasants had almost no recourse. The manor court was run by the lord or his representative. If you had a complaint against the lord, you'd have to present it to the lord, or his bailiff, who worked for him. The impartiality was somewhat lacking. Higher courts existed, but access was limited and expensive. For most peasants, the manor court was the only justice system they'd ever interact with, and it was stacked against them. That said, peasants weren't completely powerless. They had customary rights, traditions that had been followed for so long that they had the force of law. Custom said that rents should be stable, that certain fees were fixed, that particular rights couldn't be violated. And lords, most of the time, respected custom, partly because it was socially expected, and partly because if you pushed peasants too far, they might resist. And resistance, even from seemingly powerless peasants, could be a problem. Let's talk about resistance and rebellion, because peasants did push back sometimes, not often because the risks were enormous, but it happened. Resistance usually started small, passive resistance, working slowly, doing the minimum required, pretending to misunderstand instructions, letting the lord's grain get accidentally damaged. Small acts of defiance that were hard to prove, but that expressed resentment. Sometimes resistance was more direct. Peasants would petition their lord for reduced rents or fewer labor obligations. They'd present their case based on custom and precedent, arguing that the lord was violating traditional arrangements. Sometimes this worked if the lord was reasonable, or if the peasants made a compelling case. Sometimes it didn't, and the petitioners would be punished for their impudence.
And sometimes, rarely, peasants revolted. Full-on uprisings. These were almost always triggered by some combination of economic hardship and a lord pushing too far. A series of bad harvests, increased rents, new fees that violated custom, abuse of authority. Tensions would build until something snapped. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is probably the most famous example. It was triggered by new poll taxes imposed to fund wars, combined with attempts to keep wages low after the Black Death had reduced the labor supply. Peasants from across southeastern England rose up, marched on London, demanded reforms. They actually met with the young king, Richard II, and presented their grievances. The king promised reforms. The rebels went home. And then the king went back on his word, hunted down the leaders, and crushed the rebellion. Many of the participants were executed. The revolts failed, but they scared the nobility enough that some reforms eventually did happen, just slowly.
Similar uprisings occurred across Europe at various times. The French Jacquerie in 1358, the German Peasants' War in the early 1500s, though that's getting toward the end of the medieval period. These revolts were usually put down, often harshly, but they weren't pointless. They demonstrated that peasants had limits to what they'd endure, and they occasionally resulted in genuine improvements, or at least prevented things from getting worse. But most peasants never rebelled. They endured. They grumbled and resented and dreamed of better circumstances, but they kept their heads down and did the work. Because rebellion was risky and often futile, and you had a family depending on you. You couldn't risk execution or maiming or losing your land rights. So you accepted the system, because what choice did you have? The church told you to accept it too. Priests preached sermons about the three estates: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. Everyone had their place in God's plan. The nobles fought to protect society, the clergy prayed for everyone's souls, and the peasants worked to feed everyone. This was the natural order ordained by God. To resist was sinful. Your reward would come in heaven, not on earth, so be patient and obedient. This message was hammered home constantly. Every Sunday you'd hear about the importance of accepting your lot, of being humble and hard-working, of not envying the rich. The rich were rich because God had made them so, and you were poor because God had made you so, and everything was exactly as it should be. Very convenient theology for the people at the top.
But the church wasn't purely an instrument of oppression. It also provided some comfort and structure. The calendar of holy days broke up the year, giving you things to look forward to. Saints' days, feast days, fast days, they added variety to the monotonous rhythm of work. And the church did help the poor, sometimes. Monasteries often gave out alms to the needy. Hospitals, as they were usually run by religious orders. Orphans might be taken in by the church. It wasn't much, but it was something. Pilgrimage, as mentioned earlier, was an outlet. If you were pious and adventurous, you could leave your village on pilgrimage and see the wider world. You'd visit shrines, pray to saints, maybe witness a miracle. At the very least, you'd have stories to tell when you got back. Pilgrimage was one of the few socially acceptable reasons for a peasant to travel, and some people took full advantage. Religious festivals were genuinely joyful occasions. Christmas was a big deal. Not the commercialized gift-giving extravaganza we have now. Presents weren't really a thing for peasants. But there'd be special food, time off from work, church services with music and candles. The 12 days of Christmas were a legitimate holiday period. People would feast as much as their resources allowed, drink ale, play games, sing songs. It was a bright spot in the dark winter. Easter was even more important theologically, though maybe less fun. There was Lent first, 40 days of fasting and penance. Peasants were supposed to give up meat and other luxuries during Lent. Given that peasants barely ate meat anyway, this wasn't as much of a hardship as it was for the wealthy, but it still meant a more restricted diet than usual. Then, Easter itself was a celebration of resurrection and renewal, with special foods and church services. Harvest festivals, as mentioned, were times of genuine relief and celebration. Lammas in August celebrated the first wheat harvest. Michaelmas in late September marked the end of the harvest season. These were times to give thanks, to celebrate survival, to enjoy the fruits of all that labor before winter closed in again. May Day was a secular celebration with pagan roots that the church never quite managed to suppress. Dancing around the maypole, choosing a May queen, general merriment. It was a celebration of spring and fertility, and the church tolerated it, more or less, because people loved it, and banning it would have caused resentment. All Hallows' Eve, what we now call Halloween, was another festival with pagan elements. It was believed that the boundary between the living and the dead was thin on that night. People would light candles, say prayers for the dead, leave out food for wandering spirits. It was spooky, but in a communal, ritualized way that made the scary things feel more manageable. So there were moments of joy and community in peasant life. They were brief and scattered among months of hard work, but they existed. People laughed, told jokes, sang songs, danced, fell in love, enjoyed the small pleasures available to them. Life wasn't unrelenting misery every single moment, just most moments. Let's talk more specifically about women's experiences, because we've touched on it, but it deserves a deeper look. Being a peasant woman meant doing all the work peasant men did, plus an entire additional category of work. Men's work was mostly agricultural, plowing, planting, harvesting. It was seasonal and hard, but there were slow periods. Women's work was constant, year-round, and equally essential. A peasant woman's day started early. You'd get up, get the fire going if it had gone out overnight, prepare a basic breakfast. Then you'd milk the cow or goats if you had them, feed the chickens, collect eggs, make sure children were dressed and fed. All this before the sun was fully up. Then there was food preparation. Bread didn't bake itself. You'd grind grain into flour using a hand quern, which was backbreaking work. Grinding enough flour for one loaf could take an hour of constant effort. Then you'd mix the dough, let it rise, and either bake it in your hearth or take it to the communal oven. Pottage had to be made. Vegetables had to be prepared. Cheese had to be made from milk before the milk spoiled. Butter had to be churned. It was endless. Brewing ale was women's work, and it was vital. Ale didn't keep long, so you had to brew regularly. You'd soak barley, let it germinate, dry it, grind it, mix it with water and herbs, let it ferment. The whole process took days, and it required attention and skill. Women who brewed ale to sell, alewives, could earn a bit of money, though they also had to pay fees to the lord for the privilege.
Textile production was almost entirely women's work, and it was incredibly time-consuming. Spinning thread from wool or flax was something you'd do whenever you had a spare moment. Walking to the well, bring your spindle, spin while you walk. Watching the children, spin. Sitting by the fire in the evening, spin. Women spun constantly, which is why the unmarried ones were called spinsters. It was expected that women would always be spinning something. Weaving was also women's work, though men did it too in some places. But in a peasant household, the wife would do the weaving on a simple loom. Making enough cloth for one garment took weeks. Making enough for the whole family took most of the year. And you couldn't just focus on weaving, you had to fit it in around all your other tasks. Childcare was obviously primarily women's responsibility. Babies needed constant attention. Toddlers needed watching. Older children needed instruction and discipline. And you were doing all this while also cooking, cleaning, tending animals, brewing, spinning, and everything else. If you had a baby, you'd carry it with you while you worked. Cradles existed, but you couldn't just leave a baby alone in the house while you went to work in the fields or drew water from the well. So you'd strap the baby to your back or carry it in your arms and just keep working. Pregnancy was a near constant state for married women. Most women were pregnant or nursing for the majority of their adult lives, and you didn't get time off for pregnancy. You worked right up until labor started. Then you'd give birth, rest for maybe a few days if you were lucky, and get back to work, because the work didn't stop. The animals still needed feeding, the bread still needed baking, the children still needed care. Childbirth, as mentioned, was dangerous. You'd have a midwife and maybe some female relatives or neighbors to help,
Men were not present. This was women's business. The midwife would do what she could, which wasn't much beyond moral support and basic practical help like cutting the cord. If something went wrong, the baby was breech, the labor went on too long, there was too much bleeding, there was very little anyone could do. Women died. Babies died. Sometimes both died. It was tragically common. If you survived childbirth and your baby survived infancy, you'd raise that child while also maintaining all your other responsibilities. Older daughters would help once they were old enough, learning the skills they'd need for their own households. But until then, it was all on you.
Women were also responsible for health care. When someone in the family got sick, the wife and mother would be the one nursing them, preparing herbal remedies, sitting up through the night to monitor fevers. The local wise woman might provide advice, but the day-to-day care fell to the women of the household. Women also worked in the fields during busy seasons. Harvest time was all hands on deck, and women would be out there reaping grain alongside the men. Haymaking, weeding, planting, women did all of it. The idea that women stayed home while men worked the fields is false. Women did both. And on top of all this, women were expected to be obedient to their husbands. Medieval society was deeply patriarchal. A husband had legal authority over his wife. He controlled any property she brought to the marriage. He could discipline her, and while there were technically limits to this, enforcement was minimal. A woman who defied her husband could be socially ostracized, punished by the manor court, or just beaten at home with few consequences for the husband. That said, peasant marriages were often more equal in practice than in theory. When both spouses were working constantly just to survive, it created a certain practical partnership. Husbands and wives depended on each other. A good marriage was one where both partners pulled their weight and treated each other with at least basic respect. Love happened sometimes, maybe even often, but it was secondary to the practical need to survive together. Widows had a difficult position. If your husband died, you might be able to keep his land and continue farming it, especially if you had sons old enough to help. But you'd also lose the protection and labor of an adult man, which was a real disadvantage. Many widows remarried quickly out of necessity more than desire. A single woman trying to run a household and farm land alone was at a severe disadvantage. Widows without children or land were even worse off. They might become servants, working in someone else's household for food and shelter. They might rely on charity from the church or family. Some became beggars. Old age without support was grim.
Let's talk about old age in general, actually. Because if you were lucky enough to live to old age as a peasant, life didn't get easier. There was no retirement, no pension, no social security. You worked until you physically couldn't anymore. And once you couldn't work, you became dependent on others. Ideally, your children would care for you. You'd live with a son or daughter, helping out as much as you could with light tasks, and they'd provide for you. This was the expected arrangement, and it usually happened. But if you didn't have children, or if your children were too poor to support you, or if family relations were bad, you were in trouble. The church provided some charity for the elderly poor. Monasteries might give alms. Some towns had hospitals or almshouses for the indigent elderly. But resources were limited, and most elderly peasants just struggled on, doing what work they could, relying on the charity of neighbors and family. Old age also meant increasing pain and disability. A lifetime of hard labor took a toll. By your 50s, if you lived that long, you'd have arthritis, back problems,
old injuries that hadn't healed properly. Your eyesight would fail, your hearing would go, your teeth would be mostly gone. You'd be a shadow of your younger self, struggling to do tasks that used to be easy. But if you were elderly, you also had a certain status. You'd lived a long time, which meant God had favored you. You had experience and knowledge. Older women were often midwives or healers. Older men were consulted for their wisdom, even if that wisdom was mostly just do things the way we've always done them. The elderly were owed respect, and generally they received it. Death, when it came, was a public affair. People died at home, surrounded by family. There was no hospital to ship them off to. You'd die in the same room where you'd lived your whole life. The family would gather. A priest would be called, if possible, to give last rites, and you'd slip away.
The body would be washed and wrapped in a shroud, just a simple cloth. Coffins were a luxury most peasants couldn't afford. You'd be carried to the church on a board or in a reusable parish coffin and buried in the churchyard. The grave would be shallow and unmarked, or maybe marked with a simple wooden cross. Within a generation or two, no one would remember exactly where you were buried. Funerals were brief, a short service, some prayers, and into the ground you went. But there'd be a gathering afterward, a funeral feast, if the family could manage it. This was as much about supporting the living as honoring the dead. The community would come together, share food and drink, offer condolences, and help the family begin to move on. Belief in the afterlife was absolute. Everyone believed in heaven and hell. If you'd lived a good Christian life, you'd go to heaven. If you'd been wicked, you'd go to hell. Most people probably expected to spend at least some time in purgatory, a place of temporary punishment where your soul would be purged before you could enter heaven. Prayers from the living could help speed a soul through purgatory, so people would pray for their dead relatives. Masses would be said, candles would be lit. The living and the dead were still connected. Ghosts were real to medieval people. If someone died badly, without last rites, or with unfinished business, or as a victim of injustice, their spirit might linger. Ghost stories were common. People would see lights in the churchyard, hear strange noises, feel presences. These weren't campfire tales for entertainment. They were genuine beliefs, and they shaped behavior. You tried to die properly, with your affairs in order and a priest present, so your soul could rest. Let's drift back to the physical world and talk about the manor house and the lord's household, because peasants would interact with this space sometimes. The manor house was vastly more comfortable than a peasant cottage, but it wasn't the luxury palace you might imagine. It was larger, sure, with multiple rooms. There'd be a great hall where the lord ate and conducted business, private chambers for the lord and his family, a kitchen, a chapel, storage rooms. The walls were stone or timber, proper and solid. The floors were wood or tile, not dirt. There'd be tapestries and furniture and fireplaces. The lord's household included servants, some of whom might be peasants from the manor doing service as part of their obligations. You might be required to work in the manor house for a certain number of days per year, cleaning, cooking, serving at table, tending the stables. This gave you a glimpse into how the other half lived, which was probably both fascinating and deeply annoying. You'd see the waste, the abundance, the casual wealth, and then you'd go home to your one-room hut and your pottage.
Some peasants worked in the manor household permanently as servants. This was actually a step up in some ways. You'd get regular meals, better than what you'd eat at home. You'd sleep in the manor house, which was warmer.
You might receive clothing or a small wage, but you'd also be at the Lord's beck and call, subject to his moods and whims, with very little freedom. It was a trade-off. The mill was another place of regular interaction. As mentioned, you had to use the Lord's mill to grind your grain. You'd carry your sacks of grain to the mill, wait your turn, and the miller would grind it for you. The fee was usually a portion of the flour, maybe 1/16 or 1/20. The miller would take his cut right there. Millers had a reputation for being dishonest, accused of taking more than their share or mixing cheap filler into the flour. Whether this was fair or not, millers were generally not popular. Mills were powered by water or wind. Water mills were built on streams with a wheel turned by the flowing water. Windmills were built on hills where they could catch the breeze. They were impressive structures requiring significant engineering. The Lord's investment in a mill was substantial, which is part of why he insisted on monopolizing it and charging for its use. The Lord's forest was another important feature of the manor, and another source of resentment. Forests were reserved for the Lord's hunting. Deer, wild boar, rabbits, these belonged to the Lord, and taking them was poaching. Penalties for poaching were harsh. You could be fined, imprisoned, maimed, yet poaching happened anyway, because if you were starving and there were deer in the forest, the temptation was overwhelming. Even gathering dead wood from the forest could be restricted. Fallen branches for firewood, nuts and berries for food, mushrooms. Technically, these belonged to the Lord too. Some lords allowed peasants to gather dead wood on certain days or in certain areas. Others were stricter. It varied widely, but the principle was the same. The Lord owned the land and everything on it. Fish ponds were another manorial feature. The Lord would have ponds stocked with fish, and these were exclusively for his table. Peasants could sometimes fish in streams or rivers, but even that might require permission. Protein sources were restricted, one more way peasants were kept from having quite enough.
Let's talk about the Black Death, because we can't discuss medieval peasant life without addressing the plague. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and half of the population over the next few years. It was catastrophic. Villages were wiped out. Entire families died. Fields went unplanted because there was no one left to work them. For the peasants who survived, though, the plague actually improved their situation. Suddenly, labor was scarce. Lords needed workers desperately, and workers could demand better terms. Wages went up, rents went down. Peasants had leverage for the first time in generations. Some left their manors entirely, moving to new places where lords were offering better deals. The nobility tried to fight this. Laws were passed fixing wages at pre-plague levels, forbidding peasants from leaving their manors. These laws were widely ignored and difficult to enforce. The economic reality was that labor was valuable, and peasants could shop around for the best situation. This shift in the balance of power was one of the factors that eventually contributed to the decline of serfdom. But that's a long, slow process. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, things were chaotic and grim. The dead had to be buried, but there were so many that individual burials became impossible. Mass graves were dug, bodies were piled in. Priests who gave last rites often caught the plague themselves and died. The social fabric was torn apart. Survivors dealt with trauma, grief, and confusion.
Why had God allowed this? Some people became more religious, interpreting the plague as divine punishment and trying to live more piously. Others became cynical, doubting a God who would cause such suffering. Some people went wild, figuring they might die tomorrow, so they might as well enjoy today. It was a psychological crisis as much as a physical one. And then, after a few years, the plague receded. Life went on. People rebuilt. Fields were replanted. Families started over. Within a generation, there were new children who'd never known the world before the plague. The population slowly recovered, though it took over a century to get back to pre-plague levels.
The plague returned periodically. Smaller outbreaks would flare up every few decades. Medieval people learned to live with the possibility of plague the way we've learned to live with other dangers. You took precautions, you prayed, and you hoped you'd be spared. Other diseases were constant threats too. Smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery. The list is long. Child mortality was high, partly because childhood diseases were common and often fatal. Adults died of infections, fevers, mysterious illnesses that no one understood. Medicine was rudimentary, sanitation was poor, and germs weren't a known concept. People had no idea how disease actually spread. They blamed bad air, imbalanced humors, divine punishment, witchcraft. The real causes, bacteria, viruses, parasites, were invisible and unknown. So you lived with the constant possibility of sudden death. Your child could be fine in the morning and feverish by evening and dead by the next day. You could cut your hand while working, and a week later you'd be delirious with infection and dying. It made life feel precarious, fragile, which it was. This probably contributed to medieval people's religiosity. When life is uncertain and death is always close, belief in an afterlife is comforting. The promise that suffering on earth would be rewarded with eternal joy in heaven made the hardships bearable. Prayer gave you a sense of control, even if it was illusory. You couldn't cure disease or prevent disaster, but you could pray, and that was something. Let's talk about crime and punishment in a bit more detail, because we touched on it, but there's more to say. Crime among peasants was usually petty: theft of food, or firewood or tools, trespassing on the Lord's land, poaching, fighting or assault. These were the common offenses, and they were dealt with in the manor court. The manor court met regularly, maybe once a month or every few weeks. It was held in the manor house, or sometimes in the church. The lord or his steward would preside. Cases would be heard, witnesses called, judgments rendered. Punishments were usually fines. If you stole something, you'd have to pay back the value plus a fine. If you couldn't pay, you might be put in the stocks or given some other public humiliation.
Repeat offenders or serious crimes would get harsher punishment. Branding, where a hot iron would mark you permanently as a criminal. Outlawry, where you'd be banished and declared outside the law's protection. Rarely execution, though lords were reluctant to kill peasants because dead peasants don't work. For women, there were specific punishments. Scolds, women who gossiped or nagged or spoke out of turn, could be punished with the scold's bridle, a metal cage that fit over the head with a piece that went in the mouth to keep the tongue down. It was humiliating and painful. Or they'd be ducked in the river on a ducking stool. Again, public humiliation designed to enforce social norms.
accusations of witchcraft were handled by the church courts, not the manor courts. If you were accused of witchcraft, you'd be investigated by church authorities. This could mean interrogation, possibly torture, though torture was officially restricted and not supposed to be used on peasants. It happened anyway. If found guilty, you could be excommunicated, which was spiritually terrifying, or handed over to secular authorities for punishment. But actual witch trials and witch hunts were more of an early modern phenomenon, peaking in the 16th and 17th centuries. During the medieval period, witchcraft accusations happened, but they weren't as common or as deadly as they'd later become. The church's position was actually somewhat skeptical. Some theologians argued that believing in witchcraft gave too much credit to the devil's power. But folk belief in witches was strong, and local accusations did occur. Let's talk about entertainment and leisure, because even peasants had downtime occasionally. As mentioned, there were games and festivals. But day to day, what did people do for fun? Music was common. People sang while they worked, work songs that helped pass the time and coordinate group efforts. In the evenings, there might be singing for pleasure, folk songs, ballads, religious hymns. Some people played simple instruments, a flute or pipe made from wood, a small drum, maybe a stringed instrument if you were lucky. Music was a communal activity, bringing people together.
Dancing happened at festivals and celebrations. Simple folk dances, everyone in a circle or a line, moving together. It was joyful and energetic, a release of tension and a celebration of community. Storytelling was huge. Oral tradition was how information and culture were passed down. People told stories, legends, fairy tales, Bible stories, tales of local heroes or saints. These stories were entertainment and also education, teaching moral lessons and reinforcing cultural values. Games included dice, which were popular despite the church's disapproval of gambling. Simple board games like Nine Men's Morris, children's games like tag and hide and seek, ball games, though balls were expensive, so you'd make your own from bundled rags or an inflated pig bladder. Men might practice archery, partly for fun and partly because there were laws requiring able-bodied men to train with bows for military purposes. Archery butts were set up in villages, and men would practice shooting. This was one of the few activities that was both recreation and civic duty. Wrestling and rough games were popular. These could get violent, which is why I'll just say they involved a lot of physical contact, and leave it at that. Young men would compete, showing off their strength and skill, bonding through competition. For women, leisure time was scarcer, but they had their own social activities. Gathering at the well to gossip while drawing water, sitting together to spin, talking while their hands worked. These were social times, chances to share news, advice, and companionship.
Taverns and alehouses, as mentioned, were social hubs. You'd go to drink, yes, but also to talk, to hear news, to connect with people beyond your immediate family. Information spread through alehouses, news of politics, wars, changes in the law, gossip about the lord or other villagers. It was the medieval equivalent of social media, just slower and involving more ale. Festivals brought larger communities together. A village fair might draw people from surrounding villages. There'd be merchants selling goods, entertainers performing, food and drink for sale. It was exciting,
a break from the routine, a chance to see new things and new people. Young people might meet potential spouses at fairs. It was one of the few socially acceptable ways to interact with people outside your immediate area. Let's talk about the slow changes that eventually transformed peasant life, because medieval society wasn't static. Over the centuries, things shifted. After the Black Death, as mentioned, labor became more valuable. Serfdom started to decline. More peasants became free tenants, paying rent in money rather than labor. This gave them more autonomy. They could farm their land as they saw fit, sell their surplus at market, maybe even accumulate a bit of wealth. The growth of towns and trade created new opportunities. Younger sons who wouldn't inherit land might move to a town and become apprentices. Some succeeded, becoming craftsmen or merchants. This was rare, but it was possible in a way it hadn't been before. Technology slowly improved. Better plows, more efficient mills, new crops introduced from other regions. The three-field system was refined. Horse collars improved, allowing horses to pull plows more effectively. These weren't revolutionary changes, but they added up over time to increased productivity. The manorial system itself began to break down in some areas. Lords found it more profitable to rent out land for cash than to manage agricultural production directly, so they'd lease their domain to tenant farmers, collect rent, and step back from day-to-day management. This reduced the lord's direct control over peasants' lives.
But these changes were very slow and very uneven. In some regions, serfdom persisted into the early modern period or even beyond. In others, it faded away by the 1400s. It depended on local conditions, economics, the strength of traditional authority, and many other factors. By the end of the medieval period, around 1500, peasant life was still hard. People still worked the land, still struggled to survive, still had little control over their circumstances. But there was more mobility, more opportunity, and slightly more freedom than there had been in the year 1000. Progress was glacial, but it was there. Let's talk about regional differences, because medieval peasant covers a lot of ground. A peasant in England had a different experience than a peasant in Italy or Scandinavia or Poland. Climate mattered. Mediterranean peasants grew different crops than Northern European peasants, grapes and olives versus barley and rye. Legal systems varied. Some regions had harsher serfdom, others had more free peasants. In Scandinavia, the climate was harsh, but serfdom was less entrenched. Many peasants were free landowners, albeit poor ones. In Eastern Europe, serfdom actually intensified in the later medieval period, becoming more oppressive just as it was declining in the West. In Italy, especially in the north, urban culture was stronger. Peasants might live closer to towns, have more market opportunities, be drawn into trade networks. In remote rural areas of any region, isolation was the defining feature. You might live your entire life within a few miles of where you were born, never seeing a town, barely aware of the wider world. But the basics were pretty consistent. Farm, pay taxes, obey the Lord, attend church, struggle to survive, hope for better. That was the peasant experience across Europe, with local variations on the theme.
Let's bring this to a close by thinking about what we can learn from all this. Medieval peasants lived lives that were hard in ways most of us can't truly comprehend.
They worked constantly, owned almost nothing, had few rights, and died young. And yet they endured. They raised families, built communities, found moments of joy, and created a culture that sustained them through centuries of hardship. They weren't stupid or backward. They were people just like us, doing their best in difficult circumstances. They had hopes and dreams, fears and frustrations. They loved and laughed and cried. They were more than just statistics in a history book or background figures in stories about kings and knights. Understanding their lives gives us perspective. It reminds us how much our modern world has improved in terms of health, wealth, and opportunity. Running water, antibiotics, the weekend, labor laws, public education, these are things peasants couldn't even imagine, and we benefit from them every single day. It also reminds us that progress isn't inevitable. The medieval period lasted 1,000 years. For most of that time, peasant life barely changed. People accepted oppression because they didn't believe alternatives were possible. Change came slowly through small acts of resistance, gradual economic shifts, and eventually larger social transformations. So, yeah, you wouldn't last a week as a medieval peasant. Neither would I. We'd be cold, hungry, exhausted, and very confused why everything smelled so bad. We'd miss our phones and our coffee and our washing machines. We'd probably die of some preventable illness within a few months. But medieval peasants did last. They lasted their whole lives and their children's lives and on for generations. They were tougher than we are in many ways. They had to be, and we owe them a debt because they're our ancestors. They survived so that we could be here living our absurdly comfortable modern lives.
So as you drift off to sleep tonight, in your warm bed, in your clean house, with your full stomach and your health and your freedom, maybe spare a thought for the medieval peasants, the ones who worked themselves to exhaustion in the fields, the ones who lived in one-room huts with dirt floors and animals, the ones who paid crushing taxes and died young and are mostly forgotten. They were real people. They mattered, and their lives, as hard as they were, are worth remembering. Rest well, appreciate what you have, and be very, very glad you weren't born in medieval Europe as a peasant.
Still here? Still cozy? Good. We're in the home stretch now. We've covered the big picture of medieval peasant life, the structure, the work, the suffering, the rare moments of joy. But there's something satisfying about zooming in even closer, looking at the tiny details that made up daily existence, the specific tools, the exact processes, the small routines that filled the hours. Because history isn't just about the big events and the social structures, it's also about the texture of ordinary life. The feel of a wooden plow handle worn smooth by generations of hands, the smell of bread baking, the sound of a village waking up at dawn. So let's spend this final stretch wandering through those details, taking our time, letting the rhythm of medieval peasant life wash over us. And then we'll bring it all to a close, step back, and think about what it all means. Let's start with tools, because tools were everything. A peasant's livelihood depended entirely on having the right tools and keeping them in working order. And these weren't things you could just run out and buy. Tools were expensive, precious, passed down through generations. The plow was the single most important agricultural tool.
Early medieval plows were simple scratch plows, basically just a pointed stick that you dragged through the soil to make a shallow furrow. Later, the heavy moldboard plow was developed. This was a more sophisticated device with a blade that cut into the soil, a plowshare that lifted it, and a moldboard that turned it over. This allowed for deeper plowing and better soil preparation, especially in the heavy clay soils of northern Europe. But plows were expensive. A good plow with all its iron fittings might cost more than a peasant could earn in a year. So plows were often shared. Several families would own a plow together, or the village would have a common plow that everyone used. And you needed an ox or a horse to pull it. Oxen were more common for peasants. They were slower than horses, but stronger and cheaper to maintain. A good ox was a valuable animal, worth protecting and caring for. The scythe was used for cutting hay and grain. It had a long wooden handle and a curved metal blade. Using a scythe properly required skill and strength. You'd swing it in a smooth, sweeping motion, cutting through the stalks at ground level. Get the rhythm wrong, and you'd tire yourself out quickly or cut yourself. Scythe blades needed regular sharpening, which was done with a wheatstone. You'd carry the wheatstone with you in the field, stopping periodically to sharpen the blade.
Sickles were smaller, handheld tools with curved blades, used for harvesting grain. You'd grasp the stalks with one hand and cut them with the sickle in the other, then bundle them into sheaths. It was slower than using a scythe, but more precise. Women often used sickles during harvest, while men used scythes. Flails were used for threshing, separating grain from the stalks. A flail was two wooden sticks joined by a short chain or piece of leather. You'd lay the harvested grain on the ground and beat it with the flail, over and over, until the grain separated. Then you'd winnow it, tossing it in the air so the wind would blow away the chaff and leave the heavier grain behind. Threshing was tedious, repetitive work, but absolutely necessary. Spades and hoes were used for digging and weeding. All metal tools were rare. Usually you'd have a wooden handle with an iron blade attached. The iron was the expensive part. Blacksmiths charged good money for iron tools, and you took care of them. You'd clean them after use, keep them dry to prevent rust, sharpen them when needed. Rakes, pitchforks, wooden buckets, baskets woven from willow or reeds, these were everyday items, most of which you could make yourself if you had the skill and materials. But even simple wooden tools took time to make and wore out with use, so you were constantly maintaining and replacing things. Looms for weaving were large, complex tools. A simple vertical loom could be set up at home, just a wooden frame with weights to keep the vertical threads taut. You'd weave the horizontal threads through by hand, row by row. It was slow, meditative work. More complex horizontal looms existed and were more efficient, but they were expensive and took up a lot of space. Spinning wheels were a medieval invention that gradually replaced the older method of using a drop spindle. A spinning wheel let you spin thread much faster, but they were costly, so many peasant women continued using drop spindles, a simple weighted stick that you'd spin while drawing out the fibers. You could spin while walking, while watching children, while talking. Your hands learned the motion so well you could do it without thinking. Cooking was done over an open fire in the hearth. You'd have an iron pot or ceramic pot that you'd hang over the fire or set directly in the coals. Iron pots were durable but expensive. Ceramic pots were cheaper but fragile. Drop one and it would shatter. You'd also have a few wooden bowls and spoons, maybe some knives. That was pretty much the entire kitchen equipment for most peasants. Bread ovens, where they existed, were communal.
a large domed oven made of brick or clay, heated by burning wood inside until the bricks were hot, then raking out the coals and putting the bread directly on the hot floor. The residual heat would bake the bread. These ovens could bake multiple loaves at once, which is why it made sense to share them. On baking day, you'd prepare your dough, carry it to the oven, wait your turn, and bake. Then you'd carry the loaves home, and that bread would need to last your family for several days or even a week. Let's talk more about the animals because livestock were central to peasant life. A cow was incredibly valuable. Cows provided milk, which you'd turn into cheese and butter. A cow could also be bred to produce calves, increasing your livestock. Cows could pull plows, though oxen were better for heavy work. When a cow finally died or had to be slaughtered, you'd get meat and leather. Nothing was wasted. The hide would be tanned into leather. The bones might be made into tools or boiled for soup. Even the hooves and horns had uses. But keeping a cow alive was work. You needed pasture or hay to feed it. You needed to milk it daily. You needed to manage its health, which was tricky when you didn't really understand animal medicine. A sick cow was a disaster. Cows got diseases, parasites, infections. Sometimes they died, and you'd lose that huge investment. So you were constantly anxious about your animals. Pigs were easier to keep in some ways. They'd eat almost anything, food scraps, acorns, whatever. You could let them forage in the forest during autumn when acorns and beech nuts were falling. Pigs grew fast, and a single pig could provide a lot of meat. But pigs were also destructive and hard to control. They'd root up your garden if they got loose. They'd eat anything, including things they shouldn't. But the trade-off was worth it. When you slaughtered a pig, usually in late autumn, it was a major event. You'd use every single part. The meat would be salted or smoked to preserve it. The fat would be rendered into lard for cooking. The blood would be made into blood sausage. The intestines would be cleaned and used as sausage casings. The skin would be used. The organs would be eaten fresh. A single pig could provide protein for months.
Chickens were common. They were small, easy to keep, and productive. Hens laid eggs regularly, giving you a reliable protein source. You could eat the eggs fresh or preserve them by coating them in fat or storing them in salt. Chickens would also eat bugs and weeds, making them useful for pest control. When a hen stopped laying, you'd eat it. Roosters were kept for breeding and also ended up in the pot eventually. Sheep were kept for wool, primarily. Every spring you'd shear them, getting a fleece that could be processed into thread and then cloth. Sheep also provided meat and milk, though sheep's milk was less common than cow's milk in most places. Sheep were hardy and could graze on marginal land, making them a good investment. Goats were similar to sheep, but hardier and more independent. They'd eat almost anything, including things that would poison other animals. Goat's milk was common and easier to digest than cow's milk. Goats were kept by poorer peasants who couldn't afford a cow. Horses were rare for peasants. Horses were expensive to buy and to keep. They needed better food than oxen. Horses were faster and could work longer hours, but most peasants couldn't afford them. Horses were more common among wealthier peasants or used by the lord and his household. Dogs were working animals, not pets in the modern sense. They'd guard the house, herd sheep, help with hunting if you were allowed to hunt. You wouldn't pamper a dog. It would eat scraps and sleep outside or in the barn. But dogs were valued for their usefulness. Cats were tolerated because they killed mice and rats. Grain stores attracted rodents, and rodents ate your food and spread disease. A good mouser was worth having around.
But cats weren't pampered either. They were semi-feral, living around the house and barn, feeding themselves mostly by hunting.
Let's talk about the process of making cloth in more detail, because it's fascinating how much work went into something we take completely for granted. Start with a sheep. In spring, you'd shear it, which required skill and strength. You'd pin the sheep, hold it still, and cut the fleece off with hand shears. Try not to cut the sheep. Try not to get kicked. Get the fleece off in one piece if possible. The raw fleece would be filthy, full of dirt, vegetation, lanolin, sometimes parasites. So first, you'd wash it. You'd soak it in water, agitate it, rinse it, and repeat until it was reasonably clean. Then you'd dry it, laying it out in the sun. Next came carding, using 2 flat paddles with short wire teeth to comb the fibers and align them. You'd place a clump of wool on one card, then drag the other card across it repeatedly until the fibers were all going the same direction and the wool was fluffy. This prepared it for spinning. Spinning was the process of drawing out the fibers and twisting them into thread. With a drop spindle, you'd attach some fibers to the spindle, spin it, and let gravity pull it down while you drew out more fibers with your other hand. The twist would travel up the fiber, turning it into thread. When the spindle reached the ground, you'd wind the thread onto it and start again, over and over. It took hours to spin enough thread for even a small project. With a spinning wheel, the process was faster but similar. You'd work the pedal to spin the wheel, which would twist the fibers while you drew them out with your hands. You'd still need to be constantly feeding fibers and managing the tension. Spinning was skilled work, and it was endless. You spun whenever you had a spare moment. Once you had thread, you'd weave it into cloth. Set up the loom with vertical threads, the warp, then weave the horizontal threads, the weft, through, over and under, over and under. Row by row, the cloth would build up. A single piece of cloth large enough for a tunic might take weeks of weaving.
The cloth would then need to be fulled, washed and pounded to shrink it and make it denser. Sometimes this was done by trampling the cloth in a trough of water, which is where the occupation of fuller comes from. Sometimes you'd just agitate it by hand. Either way, it was more work. Then you'd cut and sew the cloth into a garment, all by hand, every stitch. And finally, months after you first sheared that sheep, you'd have a tunic. One tunic. Now understand why people owned so few clothes. Linen production was similar, but started with flax instead of wool. Flax had to be grown, harvested, retted in water to separate the fibers, dried, beaten to break down the woody parts, combed to separate the fibers. Then you'd spin it and weave it just like wool. Linen was lighter and cooler than wool, better for undergarments and summer wear, but it was just as much work to produce. Let's talk about food preservation in more detail. You couldn't refrigerate anything, so keeping food from spoiling was a constant challenge. Salt was the primary preservative. You'd salt meat heavily, packing it in salt or submerging it in brine. The salt would draw out moisture and prevent bacterial growth. Salted meat would keep for months, even years if packed well. But it would also be incredibly salty and tough. You'd need to soak it in water before cooking to make it palatable. Smoking was another preservation method. You'd hang meat or fish in a smokehouse, a small building or chamber where you'd maintain a smoky fire. The smoke would dry the meat and deposit compounds that inhibited spoilage. Smoked meat had a distinctive flavor and would last for months. Drying was used for fish, meat, and fruit. You'd slice things thin and hang them in the sun and wind until all the moisture was gone. Dried food was lightweight and shelf-stable, but needed to be rehydrated before eating.
Pickling in vinegar or brine preserved vegetables. Cabbage would be made into sauerkraut, shredded, salted, and left to ferment. The fermentation would preserve it and create a tangy flavor. Other vegetables could be pickled in vinegar, which was expensive but effective. Fruit would be dried or made into preserves if you had honey or sugar, which most peasants didn't. Apples and pears would be dried. Berries might be cooked down into a thick paste that would keep for a while. Grain and dried legumes were naturally shelf-stable if kept dry and protected from rodents. Grain would be stored in barrels or bins, carefully guarded. Weevils and mice were constant threats. You'd check your stores regularly, removing any spoiled grain before it contaminated the rest. Dairy was turned into cheese because fresh milk spoiled within a day, especially in summer. Cheese making was an art. You'd add rennet to milk to curdle it, separate the curds from the whey, press the curds into a form, and then age the cheese. Different regions had different cheese varieties based on local traditions. Hard cheeses aged for months would keep much longer than soft, fresh cheeses. Butter was made by churning cream until the fat separated. The butter would be salted for preservation and packed into containers. Salted butter would keep for weeks or even months. Eggs could be preserved by coating them in fat or packing them in salt or ash. These methods weren't perfect, but they extended the life of eggs beyond the few days they'd last fresh.
Everything was about maximizing the use of food when it was available and making it last through seasons when nothing was growing. Food security was always uncertain. A failed harvest, a sick cow, a broken storage container, an infestation of rats, any of these could mean hunger. Let's talk about brewing ale in detail because it was such an important and common task. Ale was different from modern beer. It wasn't hopped, it was lower alcohol, and it didn't keep very long. You'd make it in small batches and drink it within a few days. The process started with malting. You'd soak barley in water until it started to germinate, then dry it to stop the germination. This converted the starches in the grain to sugars. The dried malt would be ground into a coarse meal. You'd mix the malt with hot water in a large vessel and let it sit. The hot water would extract the sugars, creating a sweet liquid called wort. You'd drain off the wort and bring it to a boil. Instead of hops, medieval brewers used a mix of herbs called groot, things like yarrow, bog myrtle, heather, various other plants depending on the region. These added flavor and had some preservative qualities. You'd add the groot during the boil. After boiling, you'd cool the wort and add yeast, except you didn't really add yeast because yeast as a concept wasn't understood.
You'd just let wild yeast from the air colonize the liquid, or you'd save some of the foam from a previous batch and add that. The yeast would ferment the sugars, producing alcohol and carbon dioxide.
Within a few days, you'd have ale, weak ale, maybe 2 or 3% alcohol, but enough to make it safer to drink than water. You'd store it in barrels or jugs and drink it quickly before it spoiled. Women did most of the brewing. It was considered domestic work, like cooking and cleaning. Alewives who brewed for sale would put a sign outside their house, often a pole or broom, to let people know ale was available. This was a way for women to earn a bit of money, though they had to pay fees to the Lord for the privilege of selling ale. Let's drift into the liturgical calendar and how it structured peasant life. The church year was a cycle of feasts and fasts, seasons and celebrations, and peasants organized their lives around it. Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, was a penitential season. You were supposed to fast and prepare spiritually for Christ's birth. Christmas itself was a 12-day celebration, from December 25th to Epiphany on January 6th. This was one of the few times of year that peasants got a real break from work. There'd be special church services, better food, ale, celebrations. The 12 days of Christmas were a bright spot in the dark winter. After Epiphany, life returned to its normal rhythm until Lent. Lent was 40 days of fasting before Easter, starting on Ash Wednesday. During Lent, you were supposed to give up meat, dairy, eggs, and other rich foods. For peasants who rarely ate these things anyway, Lent wasn't as harsh as it was for the wealthy, but it still meant a more restricted diet. Lenten food was pottage made with vegetables and dried legumes, bread, fish if you could get it. Easter was the most important day of the Christian year, celebrating Christ's resurrection. After weeks of fasting, Easter was a feast. You'd go to church, participate in the services, and then celebrate with the best food you could manage. Eggs were especially associated with Easter. They'd been forbidden during Lent, so eating them on Easter was a treat. Eggs would be decorated, given as gifts, eaten in abundance.
Pentecost, 50 days after Easter, was another major feast. Then came the long stretch of ordinary time through summer and into fall, punctuated by various saints' days. Each day of the year was dedicated to at least one saint, and local patron saints would be celebrated with special services and sometimes a village feast. Rogation days in late spring involved walking the boundaries of the parish in a ritual procession, blessing the fields and asking for God's protection of the crops. This was a community event, everyone walking together, stopping at landmarks to pray. It reinforced the boundaries of the community and invoked divine favor for the harvest. Lammas on August 1st celebrated the wheat harvest. Lammas comes from loaf mass. Loaves made from the first wheat would be blessed in church. Michaelmas on September 29th marked the end of harvest and the beginning of the new agricultural year. This was when annual rents were due, when contracts were renewed, when new servants were hired. All Saints' Day on November 1st and All Souls' Day on November 2nd were for honoring the dead. All the saints on the first day and all the faithful departed on the second. People would pray for their deceased relatives, visit graves, light candles. It was solemn but also comforting, a reminder of the connection between the living and the dead.
This yearly cycle gave structure and meaning to life. It broke up the monotony, gave you things to anticipate, connected your daily work to a larger spiritual framework. You weren't just planting grain, you were participating in the cycle of death and rebirth that Easter celebrated. You weren't just harvesting, you were gathering the gifts God had provided, and you'd thank Him at Lammas. Let's talk about marriage and courtship customs in more detail. Peasant marriages were practical arrangements, but that doesn't mean there was no romance or choice involved. Young people would meet at church, at village celebrations, at markets. They'd talk, flirt, get to know each other. Parents would certainly have input. You wouldn't marry someone your family strongly objected to, but you also wouldn't marry someone you found completely intolerable.
Betrothal was the formal agreement to marry. This was a binding contract taken very seriously. A betrothed couple was considered committed to each other, and breaking a betrothal was a serious matter that might require involvement of the church court. The actual wedding would be simple. You'd gather at the church door, literally standing outside the church, and exchange vows in front of witnesses. The priest would officiate, but the essential thing was the mutual consent of the bride and groom. You'd say the words, exchange a ring if you had one, and you were married. Then you'd go inside for a nuptial mass. After the church ceremony, there'd be a celebration, if the families could afford it, a feast with neighbors and relatives, ale flowing, music and dancing. This was a major social event, bringing the community together. The couple would then go to their home, probably a one-room cottage, and begin their life together. A newly married couple would often live with one set of parents initially until they could set up their own household, or they might take over a cottage left vacant by a death. Housing was limited, so you took what you could get. The marriage would be consummated, and hopefully the woman would become pregnant soon. Children were expected and desired. A marriage without children was pitied and sometimes viewed with suspicion. Was one of them cursed? Had they angered God? Infertility was almost always blamed on the woman, unfairly but universally. Pregnancy was both hoped for and feared. Hoped for because children were valuable and because motherhood was a woman's expected role. Feared because childbirth was so dangerous. Every pregnancy carried the real possibility of death.
When a woman went into labor, the men would leave. This was women's business. The midwife would be summoned, along with female relatives and neighbors. They'd gather in the house, prepare what was needed, clean cloths, hot water, perhaps some herbal remedies to ease pain or speed labor. The woman would labor for hours, sometimes days. The midwife would offer encouragement, check the progression, try to help in whatever ways she could. If the baby was positioned wrong or something else went wrong, there was very little anyone could do. The midwife might try to turn the baby, might try various techniques passed down through generations, but sometimes it was just hopeless. If both mother and baby survived, there would be relief and joy. The baby would be washed and swaddled. Within days, it would be baptized. This was urgent because an unbaptized baby who died couldn't go to heaven. The baptism would be simple, at the village church, with godparents who would promise to help raise the child in the faith. Then began the exhausting reality of caring for an infant while also maintaining all your other responsibilities. The baby would nurse frequently. You'd carry it with you while you worked. You'd lose sleep. Your body would be recovering from the trauma of birth. And you'd be anxious, constantly watching for signs of illness, because infant mortality was so high.
If the baby died, as so many did, you'd grieve, but you'd also move forward because you had to. There would be a tiny funeral, a small grave in the churchyard, and life would continue. Let's talk about some specific historical examples, because peasants occasionally show up in historical records, and we can glimpse their individual lives. Manor court rolls, records of the local court proceedings, sometimes mention peasants by name.
In an English manor court roll from the 1290s, there's a case of Agnes, daughter of John, who was fined for brewing ale without a license. Just a small fine, a few pence, but it tells us Agnes was brewing and probably selling ale without paying the Lord's fee. Was she poor and desperate for income? Was she just trying to avoid the fee? We don't know, but she was a real person with a name, trying to get by. Another record mentions William the Smith, fined for letting his pig damage the Lord's crops. William had a pig, which suggests he wasn't the poorest peasant, but he didn't have adequate fencing or control, and the pig got loose. It's such a mundane little incident, but it brings William to life. We can picture him chasing his pig, frustrated, knowing he'll have to pay a fine. There are records of disputes between peasants. John claims Thomas owes him money for some grain. Margaret accuses Eleanor of stealing her chicken. These petty conflicts were brought before the manor court and decided. Reading them, you get a sense of village life, the close quarters, the tensions, the gossip, the occasional feuds between neighbors. Some records mention punishments. Robert was put in the stocks for getting drunk and fighting. Alice was fined for being a scold. These brief notations are all that remain of these people's lives, but they're hints of real personalities and conflicts. Occasionally, we get more detail. There are a few surviving letters written by or for peasants, though literacy was rare. There are coroner's reports when someone died under unusual circumstances. A man drowned in a river. A woman fell from a ladder while thatching a roof. A child wandered off and wasn't found until too late. These tragic little snippets are windows into peasant lives. We know names. We know occupations. We know they had disputes and debts and families and problems. They weren't just a faceless mass of peasants. They were individuals, as varied and complex as people today.
Let's talk about the commons, the common land that was crucial to peasant survival. Most manors had some land designated as common land, where all the villagers had rights. You could graze your animals on the common pasture. You could gather firewood from the common woodland. You could fish in the common stream. These weren't acts of generosity by the Lord. These were customary rights defended fiercely by the community. The commons were managed collectively. The village would decide together how many animals each household could graze to prevent overgrazing. They'd agree on rules about cutting wood, maybe only dead wood or only certain areas. Breaking these communal rules could result in fines or social ostracism. The commons were essential because peasant holdings were so small. Your strips of farmland might be barely enough to feed your family, but if you could graze a cow on the commons, gather firewood there, forage for nuts and berries, catch fish, these supplemental resources made survival possible. Enclosure, when lords or wealthy peasants fenced off common land for private use, was a disaster for poor peasants. It happened sometimes, and it was bitterly resented. Taking away the commons removed a crucial safety net. This became a major issue in later centuries.
But even in the medieval period, conflicts over common rights occurred. Let's talk about the rare luxuries that might appear in a peasant's life. Most of what we've discussed is the baseline, the typical experience of a poor to middling peasant, but occasionally there'd be something special. A ribbon bought at a fair, brightly colored, a rare bit of decoration. A wife might treasure it, wear it on special occasions, pass it down to a daughter.
A piece of nice cloth, perhaps received as a gift or purchased after a particularly good harvest, enough for a new shirt or a small bit of trim on a garment. Spices were incredibly rare for peasants, but occasionally accessible. A pinch of pepper or a bit of ginger used sparingly in a special meal. These were precious, kept carefully, used only for celebrations. Honey was the only sweetener available, and it was valuable. A bit of honey in your ale or drizzled on bread was a real treat. Beeswax was equally valuable for making candles, much better than rushlights, though too expensive for regular use. A mirror was almost unimaginable luxury, but polished metal surfaces existed, and a peasant might occasionally see their reflection in water or a borrowed piece of polished metal. Most peasants had no clear idea what they looked like. Books were completely out of reach. Even if you could read, which almost no peasants could, books were hand-copied and wildly expensive. The Bible existed, but it was chained in the church, in Latin, inaccessible. Peasants experienced Christianity entirely through oral tradition, church services, and religious art. A pilgrimage, as mentioned, was both a spiritual journey and an adventure. For someone who'd never traveled, walking to a distant shrine was a chance to see the world. You'd meet other pilgrims, see new places, hear new ideas. It was one of the few ways to broaden your horizons. Let's talk about how wars affected peasants. Wars were fought by nobles and their retainers, but peasants bore much of the cost. Armies would march through the countryside, taking food, supplies, sometimes burning villages. Soldiers weren't careful to distinguish between enemy peasants and their own side's peasants. They'd take what they needed, and peasants suffered.
Taxes increased during wartime. The king needed money to pay soldiers and buy equipment, so he'd levy new taxes. Lords would pass these costs on to their peasants. An already tight budget would become impossible. Some peasants would be pressed into service as laborers, digging fortifications or hauling supplies. This was unpaid, forced labor on top of all the other obligations. And if you were taken away from your farm during planting or harvest season, your family would struggle. Occasionally, peasants were recruited as soldiers, though this was more common in later periods. Medieval armies were mostly composed of nobles and professional soldiers, but during desperate times, peasants might be called up. They'd be given minimal training and poor equipment and sent into danger. Most had no interest in fighting and would desert if they got the chance. The aftermath of war was hunger. Fields trampled or burned, livestock stolen, villages destroyed. Recovery took years. Famines often followed wars, killing more people than the fighting itself. Let's bring this toward a close by thinking about the transition out of the medieval period. Change came slowly, but by the 1500s, the world was shifting. The Renaissance was bringing new ideas. The printing press was spreading literacy. The Protestant Reformation was challenging the Church's authority. Exploration was opening up new trade routes. For peasants, these changes were distant at first. You still worked the land, still struggled to survive. But gradually, the feudal system was breaking down. Serfdom was fading in Western Europe,
replaced by tenant farming and wage labor. Towns were growing, creating new opportunities. The scientific revolution would eventually transform agriculture with new techniques and crops. The Enlightenment would spread ideas about human rights and dignity. The Industrial Revolution would pull people off the land and into factories, creating new problems, but also ending the isolation and stagnation of medieval rural life.
But these transformations took centuries. For the peasants living in the 1200s or 1300s, the future was unimaginable. They lived in the present, doing what their ancestors had done, expecting their descendants to do the same. And yet they were the foundation of everything. The food they grew fed the armies, the monks, the scholars, the artists. The taxes they paid funded the cathedrals, the universities, the explorations. They got none of the glory and little of the benefit, but without them, none of it would have been possible. Medieval civilization was built on the backs of peasants, literally. Their labor, their suffering, their endurance made everything else possible. The kings and knights and priests we read about in history books were all supported by the silent majority of peasants who worked and died in obscurity. So when we think about the medieval period, we should think about them, not just the dramatic battles and the grand cathedrals and the tragic romances of nobles. We should think about the people in the fields, the women at the hearths, the children watching sheep, the ones who made up most of humanity, but who left the fewest traces. Their lives were hard, harder than we can truly comprehend from our comfortable modern vantage point. They worked constantly, owned almost nothing, and died young. They lived with pain, hunger, fear, and very little hope that things would improve. But they endured. They loved their children and their communities. They found moments of joy at festivals and celebrations. They took pride in their work, in a good harvest, in skills well practiced. They were resilient and resourceful and tougher than we can imagine. And they were human, fully, completely human, with the same range of emotions and desires and frustrations we have. They weren't simpler or more primitive. They were just people, doing their best in difficult circumstances. Understanding their lives helps us appreciate our own. The privileges we enjoy, education, healthcare, leisure time, political rights, material abundance, were unimaginable to them. We live like kings compared to medieval peasants. Our bad days would be their normal. Our normal would be their impossible fantasy. It also gives us perspective on progress. Change is possible. The feudal system seemed eternal and unchangeable to the people living under it, but it did eventually end. Injustice and oppression aren't permanent. They can be challenged and overcome, though it takes time and courage, and often many generations. The medieval peasants didn't have the tools or knowledge or political power to transform their world, but they survived it, and they passed on their lives and their experiences, and eventually their descendants built something different, something better, at least in many ways. We're those descendants. We carry their DNA, their resilience, their humanity. They're our ancestors, whether literally or spiritually. We owe them our existence and our world. So, as we come to the end of this long, meandering journey through medieval peasant life, let's take a moment to honor them, the unnamed, the forgotten,
The ones who lived and died in tiny villages we'll never hear about. They mattered. Their lives had meaning and dignity, even if the world didn't recognize it.
And let's appreciate what we have. This warm room, this comfortable bed, this full stomach, this freedom to choose our own path. These aren't guarantees, they're gifts, bought with centuries of struggle and progress. Rest well tonight. Dream peacefully, and maybe, just maybe, spare a grateful thought for the medieval peasants who endured so much, who worked so hard, who were so thoroughly human in the face of such hardship. You wouldn't have lasted a week in their world. Neither would I. But they did. They lasted lifetimes, and that's worth remembering. Sleep now. The story's told, the peasants have had their moment, and you, in your warm bed, with your full belly and your free life, can drift off into peaceful sleep, grateful for the modern world and mindful of those who came before. Good night. Rest easy and appreciate the simple miracle of being alive, right here, right now, instead of in a medieval village working the Lord's fields. The end. Sleep tight.